In my previous video, I introduced the regress problem and discussed how it argues in favor of skepticism. I examined some common solutions and determined that only classical foundationalism has the resources to solve the problem and avoid skepticism. But perhaps I'm asking us to do too much work. Perhaps I'm taking skepticism much too seriously and needlessly limiting my foundational beliefs. In this video, we will examine another sort of foundationalism, one that says knowledge is much easier to come by. Most contemporary philosophers disagree with the solution I proposed to skepticism in my previous video. For various reasons, they argue that it either doesn't work or else is much too restrictive. Their alternative position is known as epistemic externalism, and it contrasts with my position known as internalism. Basically, internalism is the thesis that knowledge depends exclusively upon reasons for which I have some sort of awareness. Externalism is the thesis that knowledge depends in part upon reasons of which I have no awareness. Rather than seeing justification as being a matter of evidence, externalists tend to see our beliefs as being appropriately held when they have come about through a reliable process. If externalism is correct, then solving the problem of skepticism is much easier than I have argued thus far. It is important to note that externalists do not necessarily disagree with foundationalism, which, as we noted in our last video, is the thesis that all beliefs come in one of two types, inferential and non-inferential. Inferential beliefs depend on the non-inferential beliefs for their justification. The externalist can accept this. However, he disputes the idea that anyone needs to know why the non-inferential beliefs are justified. The internalist disagrees and says that unless we know why the non-inferential beliefs are justified, then we don't know if any of our beliefs are justified. Immediately, externalism may seem vulnerable to a devastating problem. If no awareness is needed in order for our beliefs to be appropriately held, and all that is necessary is that the belief be formed reliably, doesn't this mean that we believe something appropriately even if we have overwhelming evidence against it, just as long as it was produced by a reliable process? Paul Moser expresses the concern well. On a typical reliabilist version of externalism, a person S is immediately justified in believing that P if and only if S's belief that P satisfies certain external conditions that make the belief reliable. But obviously, on this version of externalism, S can be justified in believing that P even though S believes that P on the basis of no apparent reason. Moreover, S's belief that P might be quite irrational and irresponsible from S's own epistemic perspective. But as long as that belief satisfies certain external reliability-making conditions, it is justified on externalist standards. Obviously, this is an unacceptable result of externalism. Thus, some externalists qualify their externalism and allow that a belief may be warranted apart from any sort of evidence, so long as it has been reliably produced and there are no overcoming reasons to reject the belief. These negative reasons that count against the rationality of beliefs are known as defeaters. As Alvin Plantinga, a strong externalist, explains, defeaters are reasons for giving up a belief that you hold. Acquiring a defeater for a belief puts you in a position where you can't rationally continue to hold the belief. But obviously this raises the question of why it is that negative reasons are important, while positive reasons are not. It seems quite inconsistent to reject the necessity of internal evidence for holding beliefs, while requiring that internal evidence may require us to reject a belief. Laurence BonJour states the problem this way: is there any intelligible rationale for the requirement of negative internal justification, which the modified version of externalism accepts, that does not also support the requirement of positive internal justification, which it rejects? The only clear reason for the negative requirement is that accepting beliefs that are, as far as one can tell from one's own cognitive perspective, unlikely to be true is plainly irrational. But this reason plainly supports the positive requirement as well. But what if this apparent inconsistency is necessary because requiring positive justification is not possible? Despite the fact that it is highly intuitive that we need to be aware of the reasons that our beliefs are justified, Externalists maintain that this is simply not possible at a certain level. Thus, in order to defend internalism, we must now look at the arguments that externalists offer against the possibility of internalism. In my previous video, I explained how knowledge has been traditionally defined as justified true belief. One of the most common arguments for externalism attacks this understanding. It is known as the Gettier problem. In 1963, Edmund Gettier published a 3-page paper titled "Is Justified True Belief Knowledge?" In it, Gettier argued that understanding knowledge as justified true belief was problematic, because there were examples where someone could have a justified true belief, but still not have knowledge. To illustrate this, imagine that you're waiting at an airport and you check the clock to see what time it is. The clock says that it is 10:15, and it really is 10:15. In this case, you have a justified true belief. 30 minutes later, you check the clock again, and it still says 10:15. Now you realize that the clock is broken. Nonetheless, because it really was 10:15 the first time you looked, your belief was true, but it was true by accident. Hence, it seems that you did not really have knowledge at all, despite having a justified true belief. Externalists argue that this poses a big problem for the internalist conception of knowledge. As Alvin Plantinga says, Gettier problems afflict internalist epistemologies, and they do so essentially. The essence of the Gettier problem is that it shows internalist theories of warrant to be wanting. Despite the popularity of this problem as an argument against internalism, it is rather easily resolved. We have only to observe that there are, in fact, 2 types of justification. Justification type 1 denotes having reasons or premises which support a belief and allow you to be rational in holding it. Justification type 2 includes this, but goes further and insists that the premises must actually be true. Since Gettier cases inevitably involve reaching a true conclusion by means of a false premise, they can fulfill type 1 justification, but they cannot fulfill type 2 justification. By requiring type 2 justification for true beliefs to count as knowledge, the internalist can easily solve the Gettier problem. As Timothy and Lydia McGrew conclude, the disparity between the rationality of the subject in believing and the falsity of at least one important premise gives Gettier cases their distinctive characteristics. The subject's belief is rational, while the conclusion is true for the wrong reason. The requirement of true crucial premises for inferential knowledge, together with the conferral of justification type 1 upon the subject's belief, addresses both aspects of Gettier scenarios. Although the Gettier problem is rather easily dealt with by simply extending the justification condition for knowledge, more recently Michael Bergmann has offered a much more serious argument against internalism. He's developed a dilemma which, if successful, shows that internalism is impossible. Bergmann begins by laying out the main reason for adopting internalism, what he calls the subject's perspective requirement, or SPO for short. If the subject holding a belief isn't aware of what that belief has going for it, then she isn't aware of how its status is any different from a stray hunch or an arbitrary conviction. From that, we may conclude that from her perspective, it is an accident that her belief is true, and that implies that it isn't a justified belief. Bergmann intends to show that either internalism entails complete skepticism, or else it cannot satisfy SPO. He formulates his argument as follows. An essential feature of internalism is that it makes a subject's actual or potential awareness of some justification contributor a necessary condition for the justification of any belief held by that subject. The awareness requirement by internalism is either strong awareness or weak awareness. If the awareness required by internalism is strong awareness, then internalism has vicious regress problems leading to radical skepticism. If the awareness requirement by internalism is weak awareness, then internalism is vulnerable to the SPO, in which case internalism loses its main motivation for imposing the awareness requirement. If internalism either leads to radical skepticism or loses its main motivation for imposing the awareness requirement, then we should not endorse internalism. Therefore, we should not endorse internalism. This argument is formally valid, The conclusion follows if the premises are true. Thus, in order to maintain internalism, we will have to reject one of the premises. The first two premises and the final premise are uncontroversial, so we will have to reject either premise 3 or 4. But before we can make that determination, we will need to get a clearer understanding of what is meant by strong and weak awareness. By strong awareness, Bergmann means conceptual awareness that a reason supports a belief. By weak awareness, Bergmann means non-conceptual awareness. The awareness of our justification must be one of these two options. Which is better? Let's see what the consequences would be if we were to reject premise 3 and say that strong awareness is required for knowledge. According to Bergmann, the required awareness cannot be strong and propositional because if it is, this leads to an infinite regress. The problem of an infinite regress arises for a strong awareness requirement because propositions have the potential to be false. But if something can be either true or false, then it needs justification. Hence, propositional awareness needs its own justification. If I need propositional awareness of the justification for my beliefs, then I need to be strongly aware of the justification for this propositional awareness. And then again, I need to be strongly aware of the propositional justification for this propositional awareness, and so on infinitely. Bergmann concludes, one has a justified belief only if one actually has an infinite number of beliefs of ever-increasing complexity. Consequently, it's very difficult to see how the supporter of strong awareness could resist the conclusion that none of our beliefs are justified. The very ease with which the skeptical conclusion follows from strong awareness gives us reason to reject it. As I argued at some length in my last video, infinite chains of justification are conceptually problematic, and the problems only become worse if we stipulate that one needs to be strongly aware of each justifier. So premise 3 of the argument seems to be true. Thus, if internalism is to survive, we must reject premise 4. If we instead require non-propositional or weak awareness, the problem of an infinite regress disappears. Non-propositional awareness does not have the capacity to be true or false, and, as such, requires no justification. In my last video, I sketched a rough picture of how we could obtain non-inferential justification for our beliefs through direct acquaintance. The idea of acquaintance is important because acquaintance is not propositional. Richard Fumerton explains, acquaintance is not another intentional state to be construed as a non-relational property of mind. Acquaintance is a sui generis relation that holds between a self and a thing, property or fact. To be acquainted with a fact is not by itself to have any kind of propositional knowledge or justified belief. For our purposes here, it will be helpful to give more details on precisely how acquaintances serve to justify our beliefs. According to Fumerton, non-inferential justification consists of 3 distinct acquaintances. First, direct acquaintance with a thought. All beliefs are a sort of thought. A thought is true when it corresponds to a fact in reality. Thoughts, therefore, are truth-bearers. Second, direct acquaintance with a fact. Facts are actual states of affairs. They exist independently of thoughts. A thought can only be true when it corresponds to a fact. Thus, facts are truth makers. These two elements give us necessary ingredients for justified beliefs, but they are not sufficient because one could conceivably believe something which happens to correspond to a fact, but for the wrong reasons. Thus, a true belief is not enough for knowledge. The belief needs to be justified, and so we add a third acquaintance. Direct acquaintance with the correspondence between a thought and a fact. The direct acquaintance with correspondence between truth-bearer and truth-maker ensures that the belief is justified and infallibly so. Thus, these 3 acquaintances, taken in conjunction with each other, constitute a sufficient account of how one can be immediately justified through weak, non-conceptual, non-propositional perceptual awareness. Fumerton concludes, when everything that is constitutive of a thought's being true is immediately before consciousness, there is nothing more that one could want or need to justify a belief. Bergmann is, of course, well aware of Fumerton's account. but he maintains that Fumerton cannot avoid the dilemma. Bergmann thinks it is conceivable that one could fulfill Fumerton's 3 requirements, but still fail to be aware that the belief is justified. He gives us an example. Suppose that Jack is being appeared to readily, and that he believes that he is being appeared to readily. Call this belief B2. And suppose that there is nothing of which Jack is aware to which he applies a concept like being in some way relevant to the appropriateness of holding B2. It's true that he is aware of his being appeared to readily, and perhaps he even conceives of the experience in some way. But due to a severe cognitive malfunction, he doesn't and isn't able to think of that experience as something relevant to the appropriateness of holding B2. Bergmann's strategy here is to suggest that Fumerton's theory of weak awareness does not work because examples such as that of Jack show that one can have weak awareness of something but fail to see that the awareness justifies the belief. Thus, weak awareness is simply not an option. We need to immediately be on our guard when Bergmann employs such a vague concept as severe cognitive malfunction. Bergmann's vagueness in this illustration allows him to slip a premise into his argument that the internalist can and should reject. He assumes without argument that it is actually possible for a severe cognitive malfunction to keep someone from being able to see that their belief is justified by direct acquaintance while keeping that acquaintance intact. It is not at all clear how a severe cognitive malfunction could actually ensure that Jack could not see that his belief is justified without severing his acquaintance with the fact. In order for a cognitive malfunction to destroy Jack's justification, it seems evident that this malfunction must, to some extent, change the nature of Jack's acquaintance. Thus we may respond to Bergmann by saying that acquaintance entails awareness of its object as justificatory. Travis Dickinson agrees, saying, "Can one be merely acquainted with some object and have no idea about, as in be completely oblivious to, that of which one is acquainted? On my view, the answer is no. When one is directly aware of some object, then one is aware of that object." It's redundant, I realize, but the redundancy is largely the point. The state of direct awareness necessarily makes a subjective difference. If Jack stands in the same epistemic position with respect to a fact regardless of the cognitive malfunction, then the malfunction cannot undercut the awareness of the justification that the acquaintance provides. On the other hand, if the malfunction does cause some change in Jack's epistemic position, then Bergmann needs to explain how it has removed Jack's ability to see that his acquaintance is justificatory while maintaining his direct acquaintance. Bergmann needs to be explicit on what difference the malfunction is causing and why it is precluding Jack from seeing the justifying connection between the acquaintance and his belief. His vagueness allows him to say that Jack's awareness has been impaired without explaining how this impairment hasn't also violated Jack's acquaintance with the fact. As John DePoe remarks, it seems impossible to imagine that the subject could both A. be directly acquainted with the correspondence that is supposed to obtain between the thought that P and the fact that P, and B. fail to have justification for the belief that P. To the extent that we are inclined to imagine that the subject fails to have justification in this case, it seems that we must accept that the subject fails to be directly acquainted with the relevant correspondence. But once we acknowledge that the subject is directly acquainted with the correspondence relation, it is hard to take seriously the supposition that the subject fails to see, from his perspective, the truth of his belief. Bergmann has simply asserted that this hypothetical could ever be the case. But the theory of direct acquaintance says that it is the acquaintance that provides justification. Thus, to assert that this could fail to be the case without providing a coherent account of how risks begging the question against the theory of direct acquaintance. The proponent of direct acquaintance is under no obligation to grant that this hypothetical scenario is actually possible until Bergmann establishes how a cognitive malfunction can keep a subject's acquaintance fully intact while at the same time ensuring that he does not possess awareness that it can confer justification without begging the question. Ryan Cobb chastises Bergmann on this account, saying, "It is difficult to see what else Bergmann might be looking for. Is he claiming that our acquaintances are not enough? What else could he want? Is he asking for assurance that something is an epistemic reason? That simply derives from our first level acquaintance with the facts. Is he doubting our ability to be acquainted with facts? Well, I suggest that this is being willfully obtuse, but in any case, this isn't really an objection." It seems quite likely that Bergmann's suggestion is contradictory. I am not convinced that it is possible to have a cognitive malfunction that is so severe as to change the awareness of my direct acquaintance, which does not also destroy my direct acquaintance. Until Bergmann can offer a satisfactory account of how this might be the case, I believe that we have a strong reason to reject premise 4 of his argument. We have now answered the two most serious arguments for epistemic externalism. But now let us turn to a less serious argument. Many externalists object that an awareness requirement for justification makes knowledge much too strict. So strict, in fact, that it would require us to believe that infants and animals have no knowledge, as William Alston says. But it seems clear that none of us satisfy that antecedent condition with respect to all of our beliefs, and that many human subjects and all lower animals satisfy it with respect to few or none of their beliefs. And later he says, "The concept does not apply at all to subjects that lack sufficient sophistication, reflexiveness, or freedom to be subject to intellectual requirements, prohibitions, and the like. This includes lower animals and very young children, as well as the mentally defective." The upshot of Alston's argument seems to be that internalism requires us to reject the thesis that young children and animals have any knowledge. But since they clearly do have knowledge, internalism must be rejected. This argument is flawed at nearly every level. In the first place, I see no reason why young children and animals could not have some degree of direct acquaintance. It seems plausible that they know when they are experiencing pain just as well as the rest of us. It is important to remember that internalism does not require that someone be able to give a sophisticated account in defense of how they know things. Internalism only requires that the justification for our beliefs be accessible to us. So internalism does not, in fact, require that young children and animals know nothing. But leaving this aside, why should we assume that young children and animals have knowledge in the first place? Surely our first concern should be to give an account of how our own beliefs are justified. If this has not been done, we can hardly be justified in claiming to know that anyone else has knowledge. John Depeau is right to observe that it is the unprincipled epistemologist who gerrymanders the standards for knowledge to accommodate commonly held beliefs when he discovers that his otherwise reasonable standards do not include these beliefs. Additionally, it does seem perfectly reasonable to think that young children and animals do have much less cognitive capabilities and therefore less knowledge than mature adults. This is why children do not have the same privileges and responsibilities as adults. As Paul Moser observes, the assumption that infants and lower animals have knowledge and thus justified beliefs seems gratuitous if not irrelevant. Contrary to Alston's suggestion, it is less than obvious to many of us that they do. If the kind of justified belief enjoyed by adult humans is the product of reflective, rational inquiry, we surely should restrict such justified belief to those subjects capable of reflection on the epistemic status of their beliefs. Having answered some arguments for externalism, let us turn our attention to some problems with externalism. One glaring issue is that epistemic externalism only gets you conditional justification. It is only the case that you actually know anything if some external condition is fulfilled. But since you have no way of seeing that this external condition actually is fulfilled, it follows that you have no way of justifiably believing that you really know anything at all. To see the problem more starkly, consider that for any belief which has allegedly been brought about through a reliable process, we may ask how the externalist knows that this belief was reliably produced. And to whatever answer they give, we can ask again how they know that this other belief was reliably produced. And once again, to whatever answer they give, We can ask yet again how they know that this next belief was reliably produced, and so we may continue. Either this will go on infinitely, the entire chain will end up being unjustified, or else the externalist will resort to circular reasoning. This is what is called the meta-regress problem. Timothy and Lydia McGrew state the problem this way. Externalist positive epistemic status cannot be decisively shown to obtain. The meta-regress affixes an undischarged conditional to all of the externalist's arguments and even to his foundational beliefs. His beliefs have positive epistemic status if something else is the case, and so on. A distinctively externalist problem of the meta-regress emerges from the need to defend the claim that an extrinsic connection to truth holds. As we saw in our last video, an infinite chain is out of the question, and the externalist is not going to accept that none of his beliefs are justified. Externalists choose to terminate the regress through circular reasoning. Their belief that their other beliefs have been produced by a reliable process is warranted because these other beliefs have been reliably produced. Circular reasoning is generally considered unacceptable because it commits the fallacy of begging the question. But externalists need circular reasoning to be viable in order to stop the meta-regress. Thus, although they agree that circular reasoning in general is fallacious, they allow it at a certain point. Michael Bergmann makes a distinction between two types of circularity. A logically circular argument's conclusion is identical with one of the premises, whereas an epistemically circular argument's conclusion is such that its truth is required for warranted belief in one of the premises. But is this distinction legitimate? Is there really any difference between logical circularity and epistemic circularity? I don't believe so when it comes to their ability to justify beliefs. All types of circular reasoning are equally fallacious because they are principally incapable of conferring justification. This is due to the simple fact that the truth of what the argument is supposed to establish has been assumed from the start. Hence, the argument yields no positive gain in knowledge. As the McGrews observe, epistemically circular reasoning is forceless. In particular, when deployed to show that a mode of reasoning is rational, it offers nothing in the way of genuine grounds for belief, since the cogency of the form of reasoning itself is the question at issue. Externalists are, of course, well aware of this fact, but they believe that circular reasoning is simply unavoidable. The conviction is that everyone's beliefs are ultimately justified in a circular way if you go far enough. Alston is quite clear on this. Whatever the details of our epistemic situation, there are some dosastic practices for which we cannot give a non-circular demonstration of reliability. Plantinga goes even further, saying, not even God himself, necessarily omniscient as he is, can give a non-circular argument for the reliability of his ways of forming beliefs. God himself is trapped inside the circle of his own ideas. But there's an implicit is-ought fallacy in all of this. Even if all reasoning is ultimately circular, it doesn't follow that it ought to be. Moreover, unavoidability doesn't demonstrate validity. If it were the case that we were slaves to circular reasoning, nothing about this fact would indicate that circular reasoning was capable of yielding justification. If circular reasoning is truly unavoidable, then the appropriate response would be to acknowledge that none of our beliefs are justified and to embrace skepticism. As Evan Fales says, showing that an epistemological theory entails skepticism is very far from showing that it is false. And skepticism, while clearly an undesirable conclusion to reach, is best faced as the genuine and legitimate opponent it is. In the end, then, externalism turns out to be an exercise in begging the question. Taking to its logical conclusion, externalism doesn't just fail to actually show that our beliefs are appropriately held, but it entails total and complete skepticism. Fortunately, however, things are not so bleak. We need not concede that all reasoning is ultimately circular. Both in my previous video and here, I have explained and defended classical foundationalism. Foundationalism says that all justified inferential beliefs owe their justification to non-inferentially justified beliefs. These non-inferential beliefs are justified through our direct acquaintance with the correspondence between certain facts and our beliefs. Since this acquaintance directly connects us with the truth makers of our beliefs, they are justified immediately apart from arguments. Since arguments are not involved at the foundational level, circularity is not even possible. Hence the externalist claim that circularity is unavoidable is simply false. As Richard Fumerton explains, the very source of justification includes that which makes the belief true. I have no need to turn to other beliefs to justify my belief that I am in pain, because the very fact that makes the belief true is before consciousness, as in the correspondence that holds between my thought and the fact. Again, everything one could possibly want or need by way of justification is there in consciousness. Remember that one need not be able to demonstrate that these non-inferential beliefs are in fact justified in order for them to actually be justified. The simple fact is that we cannot show people the contents of our own experience. As Fumerton concludes, if I am asked what reason I have for thinking there is such a relation as acquaintance, I will of course give the unhelpful answer that I am acquainted with such a relation. But if the view is true, it would be unreasonable to expect its proponent to give any other answer. I submit that for anyone who is not comfortable with simply assuming that their beliefs are true, and acknowledges that circular reasoning is not an option, internalist foundationalism should look very attractive. Indeed, I submit that it is the only viable epistemology. When someone asks if we have reasons for thinking that any of our beliefs are true, the externalist answer is ultimately a resounding no. If circular reasoning turns out to be the best we can do, then we should abandon the project of trying to justify our beliefs, for the grim reality would be that this is not possible. The McGrews put the matter starkly. Unless we have examined our concept of justification closely enough to see with absolute clarity that it is coherent, we must allow for the possibility that it is not. If we were to discover that it is incoherent, however, we should acknowledge that epistemology is at an end. We should not construct a pseudo-epistemology based on an attenuated and insignificant concept. Although I have argued that externalism succumbs to a fatal problem, in the end, the externalist can always say he simply does not care. If the externalist wants to dig his heels in and claim he does not care about having any assurance that his beliefs are true, there is no way to make him. In the end, then, the debate may not be able to progress beyond this point. Internalism and externalism are at an unbreachable impasse. If you are not comfortable with simply assuming that your beliefs are reliably produced, then you should not be an externalist. If this assumption doesn't bother you, then there's precious little I can say to change your mind. And I'll close by leaving you with the words of Richard Fumerton. It seems clear to me that an externalist metaepistemology is not going to provide philosophical help. You do not get a satisfying answer to a question by changing the question. You do not satisfy an existing goal by changing the goal. You cannot use perception to justify the reliability of perception. Such attempts to respond to the skeptic's concerns involve blatant, indeed pathetic, circularity. Frankly, this does seem right to me, and I hope it seems right to you. But if it does, then I suggest that you have a very powerful reason to conclude that externalism is false.